My name is David Adès. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of this monthly poetry reading series called Poets Corner, in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit. Each month, I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Mark Roberts, who will read poems from his latest book, The Office of Literary Endeavours, and talk on the theme of the poetry of place, history, and memory. But first, an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from my home in Beecroft, Sydney. Mark is recording from Darug and Gundungurra country in New South Wales. Before we begin, I would like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging, of the Wallumedegal people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and the Darug and Gundungurra peoples, the traditional custodians of the land from which Mark is recording, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Mark Roberts is a writer, critic and publisher living on unceded Darug and Gundungurra land. He was born and grew up on the land of the Wallumedegal people of the Eroa nation in Ryde and Putney, but spent a large amount of time during school holidays in Orange on Wiradjuri land. Mark began writing in the late 1970s, and in 1982 he started P76 magazine with fellow poet Adam Aitken. Over the intervening decades, Mark has mostly continued writing and publishing, though there was a break following the birth of his children. In 2011, together with his wife and partner Linda Adair, he established the online literary journal Rochford Street Review, which is now one of Australia's leading independent, that is non-funded, cultural journals, and is currently publishing issue 43. Mark has published 3 books, the latest being The Office of Literary Endeavours with Five Islands Press, from which he'll be reading today, in May 2025. His work has been widely anthologised and has appeared in numerous magazines and journals in Australia and overseas. Hi, Mark, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me. And apologies if my dog started barking in the background, but it's all part of the atmosphere up here.
We like some authenticity. So, as I've mentioned, you're reading poems today from this wonderful book, The Office of Literary Endeavours, on the theme of poetry of place, history, and memory. I can't help but think that place, history, and memory pervades the work of pretty much every poet in one way or another.
Yeah.
It is pretty hard, I think, for any poet to separate themselves from place, history, and memory when writing poems. But what is it about this theme that is particularly important to you?
So, look, I think the idea of place, particularly in a post-colonial society, is actually critical to the culture we produce. From my perspective, coming from a sort of mainly Irish background, Irish and English and a little bit of Scots in there as well, living in a colonial setting raises a whole lot of questions about how we relate to the country, how we sort of express our place in that country and our memories of how we got here, and understanding how we can develop and understand our place in country as well. So I spent a lot of time as a child around the area of Orange, Cargo on Wiradjuri land. At that time, I didn't understand we were on Wiradjuri land. It was just where my relations had a farm. Same as growing up in Sydney, we didn't, I didn't realise the history that we were taught wasn't a history that acknowledged previous occupation. So there's been a gradual learning of that lost history that sort of and the memories and culture that have lied buried in that history as well. So when I talk about place and memory, it is those memories of how I felt and understanding that the history of place, the personal history that we bring to our writing, but also the hidden histories, the things we uncover, whether they be hidden in our personal relationship to where we grew up and the relationships we had with the people we had, or the sort of buried histories, the sort of histories that we weren't allowed to understand, or that we've discovered as we've become more acquainted with place. So I guess that's a theme that I've started to develop. I've got I'm working on a larger piece of work around understanding that relationship, the private, the public histories, and the relationship to country of that place around Orange, Bathurst, Dubbo, the Wiradjuri lands that I've come to know and feel quite at home on.
I guess we've all gone through a period of coming to learn and understand something about the prior occupants of this country. And that, when I was growing up too, there was not any great consciousness of the Indigenous owners, the Indigenous inhabitants. So is this something that is emerging more and more in your writing? It wouldn't have been there when you first started writing poetry, would it?
No, although there's an interesting poem that grew out of an experience I had quite young, where I thought, this was actually a really special sort of experience that I had driving out as a teenager just after I got my license to a creek just outside of Orange, where in 1852 Lawrence Hargraves discovered, in inverted commas, gold, and hence the gold rush began. And it was quite an interesting experience because it was a very hot day. And I drove down the side of the mountain on a dirt road, hearing the sounds of the car, the rocks and the branches of the trees and things, and then getting to the bottom and the sudden silence of turning the car off, but then becoming aware that it wasn't actually a silence. There was lots of things happening around me. There was a sound of the creek, there was a sound of the wind, the trees, leaves moving against each other, and it was sort of the country sort of starting to try and talk to me. At the time, I thought, this is a really amazing experience. I want to write about it because, as a 19-year-old poet, everything is a poem. But it was such a complex sort of experience that it took a very long time sort of for that to actually get into a poem. And even now I'm sort of uncomfortable with bits and pieces of it, but it is, I think, an acknowledgement that there's something there, that there's that there are whispers, and other writers have written about the listening to the wind and what's carried on the wind, and it was a little bit of that too. So those experiences from our past can sort of over time become far more, I guess, important in the way we express ourselves and our relationship to that country. Even now that poem doesn't acknowledge the prior occupation, but it is I guess a way into listening to something beyond the everyday.
And we'll get to talk about that a bit later on because you're going to be reading that poem, I think, today. I want to just unpack the theme a little bit because there's three aspects of it: place, history, and memory. And they're all, in a way, you could say, separate elements or separate themes, but they interweave with one another. Can you speak to the ways that they are interwoven in your poetry?
Yeah, so the interconnections are, I think that's the complexity of the poem. You 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 can have a poem that is very light, one-dimensional. When you start digging into, beyond a simple description of, what's going on, that's when you start getting into the meat of the poem and trying to sort of, I guess, dig down. So the interwoven nature of context and history and narrative is really important, and the way they weave together gives you, I guess, that depth and a stepping stone to an understanding, even if it's not a complete understanding, a glimpse of what's there.
Mm. Is this um, is this a theme that's always been central to your poetry, you think?
No, look, very, very early on, like most, you know, people like, listen to music and lyrics, and the lyrics that appealed to me were sort of overtly political lyrics. I've always been a very political person, so Dylan, for example, was the protest songs and writings that Dylan did during the 60s were sort of very, I guess, formative. And that period of time, the so-called generation of 68, there were some of those poets that I came across quite young through discovering a copy of New Poetry, which was the magazine that Adamson was, well, took over the Poetry Society, and along with a couple of other people, Martin Harrison, Carl Harrison Ford, and so on, it's turned into New Poetry. The issue that I managed to sort of find contained poems by Laurie Duggan about the New England area around Armidale and travelling from Armidale to Sydney, and they were sort of quite important in looking at a complex landscape poem. So the personal, the way you relate a personal reaction to country, what's going on in your own life, and how that can be reflected in a landscape. That was, I guess, quite an important part of my development as a writer and a thinker. And I guess that's what that sort of seed is what I've been trying to develop over the decades that followed.
Mm. Do you feel a compulsion to write on this theme, as if it exerts sort of some kind of irresistible gravitational pull on you, or is it less a compulsion and more just a conscious choice? You
So look, a poem can come from many different areas. Responses to what's around you and responses to what you read. And I think you need to be in a particular place to respond in a poetic way to a situation. A lot of a lot of my time in the past has been taken up with paid work or editing and publishing magazines, the journal and those sorts of things. While they can be creative things in their own right, they don't necessarily lend you to thinking in a poetic way. If you're marking up a piece of text for the web, it's hard to get too poetic about that, or start thinking about a poem. You need to actually sort of stop doing that and take a few deep breaths and get your mind in a different situation. So you do need space. Virginia Woolf's room of one's own, as it were. But in terms of the compulsion to write about a particular thing, I think it's more a very strong interest. Okay, so an image can sort of provoke a few lines. You think, well, yep, they're working. How do I develop those lines into something more complex? And that's when you start digging into, okay, what's behind the way the shadows of a leaf fall on a fence, for example, as an image that might sort of be a trigger for something. So that may start asking, questions around the nature of the tree. Is it a deciduous tree? Is it an introduced species? There's a whole lot of stuff that you can start building on there, not necessarily in an overt way, but it's there.
You've mentioned the word complex a number of times.
Mm.
Do you regard your poetry as attempting to be layered, multi-layered?
I think the best poems are multi-layered. Even a short poem can have many different layers and meanings. And I think if you look back at sort of those political poems that I was reading, and songs that I was reading when I was sort of quite young, they don't have that complexity. They are a political statement. They may be, they may have some nice images and words in them, but they don't have the complexity that underlies those. If the best political poems are complex, they acknowledge the contradictions and the struggles that sort of lead to a certain point. So in the same way, when you're talking about history and place and memory, it is a complex area to go into, just your personal memories of things. There are multiple ways of reacting to a memory. So, yes, I think the best poems are complex, and they take work. Very rarely does a poem just sort of come out from me and leap onto the page. I can probably count that, on the number of times on my hand where I've gone, in half an hour, this is a complete poem.
Wow.
So yeah.
Okay, I got one last question, which we've probably already covered a little bit, but I'll just ask it anyway. Are you conscious of this theme of place, memory, history when you sit down to write poems, or is it something that you find just emerges from the poems once you've written
them? Look, I think it's something that is a way you approach the world. For example, having spent a lot of time, as a child in Orange and on my relation's farm, I had memories of that. When I sat down to sort of try and write from some of those memories, incidents like, feeding a joey who's, the men had sort of, shot its mother in the top paddock the night before and brought a joey home to bring up. That's, it's an interesting image, but there's a lot behind that, and it really is something that you have to go back to. For example, it wasn't until many years later on when I sort of started going back to that area, and I was traveling over the Blue Mountains and going down to Victoria Pass towards Lithgow. I suddenly felt a recognition I hadn't felt there before, sort of looking at the hills and the mountains and the way the hills rolled and the vegetation and things like that. There was I was viewing it in a new way, and that was, I guess, understanding the more complex history of that place. That it wasn't just a place that had been settled; it had been a place that had been fought over. And once you start sort of expanding your view of what's around you, the history of an area you're traveling through, becomes, when you try to write about that, that becomes the foundation of how you produce a work. So the poems that I call, the lacuna cycle, because lacuna is a term that talks about gaps in history, gaps in manuscripts. It's actually a term from medieval times where there were pages missing from manuscripts. There was the gap in the manuscript, the history. So, I don't think it's a conscious thought sitting down to write a poem that, you bring to. It's actually what drives the poetic process. You have a certain worldview, and that drives what you want to write about.
And as your understanding deepens, then more of that, there's almost a kind of seepage, isn't there, of that consciousness into the work.
And you read other work that would, that impacts you in a certain way. So yes, I've got this background of growing up in, around Orange, and that is sort of impacts a whole lot of my writing. But I've also got a lot of history around Ireland, in my great grandmother coming from Ireland. My first ancestor to come to Australia was in 1796 as an Irish political prisoner. So there's a long history there of, Irish in my family, in my family's memory as well. So there are some poems about that as well, and that's also a developing area of mine as well, because there are lots of parallels between the colonization of the Irish and the colonization of Australia, and the overlap between, the Irish being driven out of their homeland to drive somebody else out of another colonial country. So, when we talk about layers of complexity, there's a wonderful piece there. And there's one particular poem in the collection that sort of talks about returning to Ireland and some of those thoughts, and that's another area that will be developed, I guess, in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now you're going to read that poem too, I think. Shall we get started on a poem?
Yep. So which one shall we start with?
I think the one was on page 10 that I can't pronounce the name of, so you're going to have to do it for me.
Okay. Gundungurra. So this, and apologies to any Wiradjuri people who are listening. Gundungurra is the Wiradjuri name for the mountain that the settlers call Mount Canobolas, which is the large mountain just outside of Orange that sort of is, I think, the highest point between, the Blue Mountains and the Indian Ocean. It's quite an important part of the local sort of psyche. It's a Hotel Canobolas. The local council is called the Canobolas Shire. So Mount Canobolas is sort of like a centre point for the settlers, but it was also that hill was also very important to Wiradjuri, and there are lots of ceremonial sites along that hill, that mountain that we're only just sort of rediscovering. Okay, so I'll start with this poem, which is a prose poem. Gundungurra. I'm standing at the top of Mount Canobolas, Gundungurra. It is a spring morning. The sun is out, but there's a hint of ice in the breeze, which occasionally flicks a piece of yellow tape against the metal framework of a telecommunications tower. This is a return to place, a connection with country stretching through my family, the hints and suggestions of a buried history, a land that fills the imagination. I listen to the tape against the metal, like Morse code tapping out a message. I listen for a pattern, but the wind swirls around the tower, sending the sound in all directions. Above me, I see the microwave dish, mobile cells, and other pieces of electronic gadgetry. This is how we communicate. I listened for a hum which would suggest high-frequency radio signals are flashing above my head, but there's nothing but the flickering of the yellow tape. Slowly I hear further into silence, the wind moving through the trees below, the distant sound of a car heading up a dirt road, the faint rumble of a plane invisible in the sky.
So all three aspects of your theme are apparent in this poem. It's a good place to start. Place and how we connect to it over time, being in it, leaving it, returning to it, how we experience it, and how we remember it is often a part of our own personal mythologies. Can you say something about your connection to this place over time and of your family's connection to it?
Yes, so the farm that I was visiting as a child belonged to my great aunts and uncles. So I mentioned before I had a Irish political prisoner sort of arrive on the second convict ship out of Cork back in 1796. He was actually transported for administering illegal oaths in the north of Ireland, and he was a defender and was part of the 1783 uprising, I believe. Now, they on the way out, a couple of days out of Cork, they tried to mutiny and take the ship to New York, but they were unsuccessful and ended up in New South Wales, which was then 1795. That was sort of 1796, a handful of years after settlement. So it was they were in the front wave of the invasion, as it were, and what the English did to the Irish political prisoners was basically pit them against the local population. So, if you want land, you've got to take it off someone. So that he was thrust into that fairly early on. Now, that family sort of moved around the country for a long time. They obviously more people moved in, and by the early 20th century, one of their descendants married my grandmother, who had just come out from Devon, and her family had lived were Celts, basically from Cornwall, and they their parents had set up a farm in Orange when they migrated out from Devon in 1912, I think it was. So they'd worked that farm for a very long time, and only one of the children ever married and moved away. That was my grandmother. The other two sisters and their brother worked that farm right through to when they retired, very close to the ends of their life. So when I was out there during the 60s and 70s as a child and as a teenager, they were quite elderly, still working the farm, and it built up a lot of knowledge about the country that they were farming on. So there was that sense of they were for all intents and purposes, they knew that land quite well. They knew the way the weather impacted it, how you could predict rain, the direction of the wind, all those sorts of things that good farmers know. But there was that other level that, underneath that, the history of that place. They were on the slopes of Canobolas, so there was, that whole sort of ceremonial aspect of the Wiradjuri that were completely unknown to them. So that's how I got that connection to that place, was by spending a lot of time on that farm with my elderly great aunts and uncles, seeing how they related to the land, to the animals on that land, how they went out shooting kangaroos in the top paddock, for example. There was that whole sort of agricultural sort of side to it. There was a respect for the land. They approached farming in a certain way, but there's also a lack of knowledge about the country they were standing on and working on as well.
Was that a lack of interest?
Well, it was just unknown. Uh, the interactions with local Aboriginal people were very limited. There is I do have a longer poem which isn't in the book about my great grandmother who basically went blind over a period of time, aided by a country sort of doctor who put acid instead of eye drops into one of her eyes at one stage. But there was a story of her sort of helping some young Aboriginal women who were from the Cowra mission. They would spend some time each year sort of looking for work outside of the mission, and she sort of took them in while her husband was out, working on the land, and gave them sort of tea and bread and things, and so said, but don't let my husband know I'm doing this. So it was a very limited sort of exchange, and it wasn't in the interests of people working the land to understand who they'd taken it from.
Yeah. You refer to both the Indigenous name and the Western, if you like, colonial name of the mountain in the poem, but you've chosen to title it with the Indigenous name. Can you talk about why you did that?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think, and this is part of the sort of, I guess, the overlap with with my Irish background is spending time, over the last decade in Ireland. I've become aware that, my great grandmother spoke Irish. My grandfather knew a few Irish words. My mother knew none, and I know none. And in the same way that the Irish language was repressed, Australian languages were repressed by, colonization. People weren't allowed to speak their own language. And that's one of the parallels with, colonialism. I wrote somewhere that the British used Ireland as a practice ground for colonization, and that's one of the things they were very good at was denying religion, culture, language. So we're turning to looking at how over the last 10 years the Irish have embraced their language. Street names, towns are referred to now in Irish and then English. We have the new Irish president is speaks Irish before she speaks English, for example. And part of that is just getting used to the language being used again. Wiradjuri is one of the languages that we still have. A lot of Australian languages have basically died out. So Gadigal, we only have a few words. We don't have, it's difficult to, rebuild a language from a handful of words, whereas Wiradjuri we have, thanks to the work of, Uncle Stan Grant and other elders, we have a dictionary. We have that sort of, knowledge of language, and it needs to be used. And the Wiradjuri are relearning their own language, and it's important, I guess, for non-Wiradjuri people to, if you're on that country, to at least make an effort to keep that language alive. It is an Australian language. It's not a colonial language.
Yeah, actually, by coincidence, the next Poets Corner podcast will feature Jazz Money, who's also been learning Wiradjuri as part of her Indigenous sort of recovery of language.
Yeah, and look, that's really critical. And she's a wonderful poet. I recently wrote a piece in Live Encounters about place, history, and memory, and I quote from her poem. I think it's called "The Gully," which is, there's a gully in Katoomba, which was a place where a lot of local Darug and Gundungurra people sought refuge after dispossession, and then in the late 1940s, the local council decided to evict them all and build a car racing track there. And I suspect that Jazz's poem called the Gully Song is about a different gully, but it talks about, a mist seeps through this gully and I can hear song, feel smoke cling to hair, to lashes, hear the way the old voices are held here. When I read those words, it was like, well, yes, that's the feeling you get now. The gully is a place in Katoomba that's been returned to the local community, and it does have that history, and you can just imagine, that's very evocative. And yeah, she is a great poet.
And it's symbolic, I think, that we're having this discussion the day after a treaty has been signed in Victoria, Indigenous people, which is wonderful news. I'm very conscious that a place has layers, and we've talked about that a little bit, that there is the physical, visible place, which we relate to in an immediate but mostly superficial way, and that beneath that can be enormous depths of history, which requires a deeper knowledge and engagement, but which perhaps is never truly known. This poem you've just read acknowledges this. It begins with standing at the summit and relates what is visible and seen, but then turns to hints and suggestions of a buried history, a land that fills the imagination. Can you talk about this? Are you saying that no matter how deep our connection to place, it is inherently unknowable and we have to experience it through imagination?
I think there are parts of history that we can only experience through imagination. And we have to bring our imaginations to history. So it's part of the historical process. I was taught a history of settlement, of explorers sort of opening up the country. Now, yes, that's based on primary sources, but it doesn't take much imagination to understand that that story has lots of gaps in it. Now, there are ways of filling those gaps. There are primary sources European primary sources we can go to. We can also talk to the people who are dispossessed and understand the stories that they have. Now, a Western historian will say, you need to stick to your primary sources, but there's that other more personal view of history where you go, well, there are all these stories swirling around. Let's make use of those in an attempt to understand where we are, why we're here, and how we relate to country. And look, I guess one of the people who I read when I was sort of probably 20 years ago now, when I was starting to think about this, was William Least Heath Moon. And in particular Prairie Earth, which is a huge volume of a book. It's a really close reading of the prairie country of the US. And it's it's an understanding of the people who are living there now, but it also looks at what's been lost and the history and how that history has shaped the country. And there's bits of that book where he talks of just being on the prairie and looking at the grass, listening to the wind, and that's sort of like a sense of what I'm trying to get to in some of these close readings of country, sort of both here and in Ireland, because if there are areas in Ireland that have such history that that they just that they don't whisper to you, they yell at you.
Well, I mean, the poem does allude to history, but it's interesting. It suggests a buried history. This poem anyway, leaves it buried. The poem's preoccupation is with the experience of the place now, in the moment. Is that a metaphor for our often superficial relationship to place?
Look, yes, it is. That poem is a bit of a starting point as well. It's that there's an extended version of that which exists in the new manuscript. So it is an entry point to that discussion. I guess with sort of secret and buried histories, there's particularly around Orange, there's whole areas that the top layers of soil have just been removed through the gold rush. So all trace of, our previous occupation has disappeared. The carved trees, which are incredibly important to the Wiradjuri, were just, destroyed or moved to, other areas as sort of, elements of, our empire. This is a trophy, more or less. And in that poem about, the gold, finding the gold, that's, I wasn't aware of that when I wrote that poem, but subsequent to that whole sort of experience, I found out that, that whole area was just completely devastated when, thousands and thousands of people marched over the mountains to sort of see whether they could find gold and just destroyed everything in the process.
I worry that most of us rush through place, that we don't allow place to speak to us, that we don't, as you say here, gradually hear further into the silence. The poem is very focused on the sense of hearing. The narrator listens to the tape against the metal, listens for a pattern, listens for a hum. Are you suggesting that we need to stop and pay closer attention, that we cannot hear unless we listen more attentively?
Yeah, look, I think that's true. There's another author that I love on reading just because of that reason is Tim Robinson. He wrote a series of books about the Connemara in Ireland, and the preface to the first book is called "The Sound of the Past and the Moment of Writing," and he talks about the sound of the past. There's a great phrase. I think it's sort of the silence set in a velvet background like a jewel in a display case. And that's a silence that we think it's a silence, but there's actually a whole lot going on in those silences. So when we encounter something we don't know in history, that's when we should be asking the questions. What do we hear when confronted by gaps in our understanding? When the noise of the everyday or what is expected or accepted dies away, and we're left with what we feel is nothing. That nothing is where the jewel in the display case lives, wrapped in a velvet background which we can't see. So, I think I would recommend Robinson's work to anybody interested in that sort of area. There's a wonderful image in that of an old man just outside of Galway who basically is looking out to sea, and when he dies, and it's like that image, the sound of his last breath, and what becomes of his last breath as it's carried on the wind, and things like that. It's a story of his life. So, yeah, it's probably a bit took that sort of a bit deep, but yeah,
run with it. Why not?
Yeah.
All right. Would you like to read us another poem? I think Cargo Road was the next one.
Cargo Road. So, let me see if I can find that one.
It's page 16.
Yep, just got it. So, look, I referred to recently about my great aunts and uncles. So this is a poem written from the perspective of my great uncle, who was born in Devon, of a family that had lived in Cornwall for centuries, really, and suddenly the beginning of the 20th century, they uproot themselves and end up on a farm in Orange. So this is him in his later years. I'm sure he didn't think like this, but if I had been in his situation, knowing the things I know now, this is probably the poem I would have written. Cargo Road. Morning snow drifts down Gundungurra. I watch from the veranda as dark clouds hide the mountain, the snow line reaching towards the road. Flurries drift on the breeze in the bottom paddock. Cows move small clouds of breath. There will be tea inside soon and wood to bring in, and this afternoon a drive to the pub. 50 years on, this land means I know the way the weather approaches around the mountains, how to read the wind, clouds and sunsets, but the dirt still escapes me. My mother and father are the only family buried here on the hill in the town cemetery, far away from my sister and ancestors, resting in English soil. Do we need to know the dirt to lie in it, to dissolve into it? How long does it take to belong?
So you said this was about an uncle?
My great uncle.
Great uncle. So the poem alludes to two places, right? The place that your great uncle lived in for 50 years and the place of his ancestors. And there is a thread between those two places. What is the poem saying and perhaps not saying about that thread?
That's an interesting question, because he was only young when he left England, but his ancestors, his parents, his grandparents, his great-grandparents were all, they grew up in an area, 50 miles, apart. The generations of family hadn't wandered very far. They crossed the border from Cornwall into Devon, basically. So when you think of your family and your ancestors, it's interesting, because up until the middle of the 19th century, most people didn't move. They were, in one spot. There was a tradition of place. You knew things that had been handed down from generations to generations. He had to learn everything on a new country. The things that his father may have been able to tell him about, the way to work a farm in Devon or Cornwall, didn't hold true here. His father, he obviously grew up with his father working the land in Australia, learning as they went. So it's a very different experience, and yes, he got to the point where he would be able to read the weather. He'd know when changes were coming by the way, birds reacted or the way the wind changed or whatever. But there was that deeper sense of, where do I belong? The only people who have been buried in this country were his parents, who he'd come out from, Devon with. So, yeah.
So this poem captures something. I think our experience of place is intensely personal. And place exists whether you are there or not. It's your relationship and connection to place that imbues place with something more, some kind of meaning, for us each individually. So after 50 years, your grand uncle knows the way of the weather, how to read the wind, clouds and sunsets. But is this poem suggesting that there is always something inherently unknowable about place?
Well, I think it's a knowledge of country that only becomes apparent over generations. And I think that was part of the sense that I got when I returned to that area, coming down off Victoria Pass and looking out across Wiradjuri country, as an adult, knowing more about the country. That's part of that process, but it takes generations and generations to sort of reach that, and that's what we've lost. with the dispossession of the people who lived there for generations. And it's incredibly difficult to recapture in a short period of time without assistance, without the knowledge that, and without the listening, without the voices telling us what we've missed.
Sounds like someone's sawing down a tree back here. I hope that's not interfering too much.
No, look, there's so much noise happening around me. If you can't hear that, then I'm not worried about a tree falling in Beecroft.
I'm curious about the way you use dirt in this poem, about the notion of dirt still escaping your grand uncle. I would have thought that dirt was ubiquitous, especially for someone working the land. Doesn't it escape you so much as permeate everything well before you lie in it or dissolve in it? What is your thinking behind the idea that dirt still escapes him?
So I think that the dirt is lots of things. Okay, so you can sort of put your hands into the ground and feel the dirt, the soil. You can grow things in the soil. The symbolism of Whitlam pouring dirt through Vincent Legary's hands is a different understanding of dirt. It's a symbolic meaning of what that dirt actually means. I think, one of the things I'm trying to get there is saying, there's the only people who we've buried here who are lying in this country, are my parents. Beyond that, my ancestors are half a world away. So how do we understand the history of that dirt, the significance, the spirituality with such a limited background?
So the relationship to dirt is still very new, still forming. Yeah.
So we know of the concept and some of the song lines that existed, but do we know whether we're standing on a song line, or are we sort of ploughing through a song line, for example? That's the questions I'm trying to ask.
You're ploughing through a midden or a sacred site or something else. Yeah. So this poem, it observes the place that your grand uncle lived in, and he's mostly comfortable in it. Perhaps he even communes with it in his own way. It has a long lived in familiarity. But is the poem alluding to a sense that he feels that he is nevertheless an interloper, that he's there for a while on the skin of the place, that he may have taken place within him, but that the place has not taken him within it?
Yeah, look, I think that's a common, that would be a common way of looking at the way settlers relate to Australia. There's an element of cultural cringe there. Yes, this is a country we've grown up in, but is it as good as what we've left behind? There's the stories, his sister, my grandmother, had stories of Devon and Cornwall, and the Green Man, and some of the folklore of that area, and how that relates to living in Australia is sort of, well, that's a history from somewhere else. Can you impose that on this new country? Yeah, well, possibly that there are elements, they're celebrating spring and things like that, but there's actually a history of seasons, different seasons in this country than there were in where she came from. So yeah, once again, it's layers.
Yeah, it is. And it reminds me really of how people might move to a country town and they're there for 20 years, but they're still regarded as an outsider because, they didn't grow up there.
And if you take that even further, well, you've only been here for 2 generations.
Yeah.
You want to call yourself Australian, be here for 10,000 years.
Yeah. So the poem ends questioning how long does it take? How long does it take to belong? I noticed that there was no question mark at the end of that question. So it's more of a statement, really, than a question, or is it?
Yeah.
Was it intended as a rhetorical question without an answer?
I don't know the answer, so yes.
Cool. All right. Got another one for us?
Yep. What's the next one on the list?
I know you've got another one for us. Lewis Pond's Creek.
Okay.
Which is what you were talking about a little bit before, I think.
So this is, as I say, this is an experience I had probably as a 18, 19-year-old, and then sort of trying to work on a poem for, let's say, over 30 years. Okay. So there's a lot of rework, rewriting, rethinking in this poem. And there's still, I guess, development that will happen in other poems that will drive out of this. There's a reference, I think, to the birthplace of a poet in this. That would be Banjo Paterson, because on the road out to this creek, there's the remains of the farmhouse that Banjo Paterson was born in. Okay, Lewis Pond's Creek, Darug. I drive out of town across the train line and head northeast into the summer heat, past a poet's birthplace, a fenced-off ruin, then through grazing land and paddocks of canola. The road narrows as paddocks run up against the bush, then the bitumen gives out, and I'm driving on gravel and dry dirt. Rolling hills give way to flatness, the road bending around boulders coloured with age and moss. Dust hangs behind the car. I listen to the engine and the thump of stones and small branches banging against the bottom of the car. A hairpin corner, the road turns and drops down a hill. Windows down, above the engine, I hear bird calls at each hairpin. I break to a crawl and turn into my own cloud of dust. Below the road, scattered down the hillside, are boulders and smaller rocks that have rolled down the hill. I can see the creek now. I glance sideways, water and more rocks. A final hairpin, then suddenly I'm on a creek flat, a causeway ahead. I pull off onto the picnic ground and turn the engine off. Silence sudden as a gunshot. I get out, my ears still ringing, and lean against the car, looking around, seeing silence for the first time. I hear a history of sound, the clicking of the car as it settles into stillness, the engine cooling, axles and bearings dropping into rest, the hiss of a drip on hot metal. Then the creek sounds, water flowing, breaking over rocks, shouting into the still heat. I walk towards the creek where gold was found, a European sacred site, the sound of footprints, the crushing of dried leaves and twigs. I become part of the landscape. Flies find me, high-pitched against the depth of water sounds. I become aware of bird calls, some close, and answering calls distant, the repetition, a whip, a two-note song from up and down the creek valley, occasionally a unique call with no answer, a question left hanging. I can see and hear the heat, the eucalyptus haze heavy with intent. Up the hillside, the trees' groaning leaves move with a wind I can't feel. A breeze pushes a branch on a ridge one way, then stops. More leaves move against each other, fall. answering movement down the creek line or across the gully, a cacophony, a song which swirls out of the history of this place, singing of a time before gold.
Can I ask you first, Mark, about the form of this poem? It's not divided into parts, and there's no part one, part two, but it does have two distinct parts.
Mm.
The first about the journey to the picnic ground, and the second after you arrive to it.
Yeah.
The first part is written with every second line indented, to me, connoting the movement of journeying.
Mm.
The second part is in much longer, denser lines across the page, to me, connoting a place steeped in itself and its history. Is that what the form of this poem is trying to convey?
Yeah, the first part of the poem is sort of looking at the way the lines are indented is sort of trying to suggest the road, the hairpins at each as you go straight and then turn into the next hairpin, go down. So it's sort of trying to suggest that sort of traveling down the hill. Whereas the second part is once that pattern, that rhythm of that trip of driving straight, turning, driving straight, and suddenly when you turn the car off and there's you're not used to that silence. And as William Lee Moon sort of said, the silence, and then becoming aware of the wind and all those things that are the hidden noise in the silence.
The reference to the creek where gold was found, a European sacred site, really really struck me. It seems to me to mock, and perhaps rightly so, what Europeans regarded as sacred, which seems hollow and superficial when considered next to indigenous sacred sites of country, which venerate country itself rather than something extracted from it. Was what you intended to?
Yes, and as I said, this is a developing. There are developing themes in this that I think I'm still working on, but the whole point of this particular spot, this was where the gold was first officially found. It had been found, they'd found gold, for 20, 30 years beforehand, but it was hushed up because it was like, well, what will happen when the convicts find that there's gold? Everybody will just leave whatever they're doing and go to the gold fields. The political imperative here was the Californian gold fields were, meaning people were leaving the colony to sort of go to the gold fields in California. Suddenly it became important to have our own gold fields. So, a decision was made to, let's make an official finding of gold, and then it's all on.
But up until then, there's another form of silence.
Yeah, it's once again, it's the colonial authorities, dictating history. This is what we want to know, and what happened here was, yes, gold was found, and there was an influx of people walking off their job, walking out of, what was then the town of Sydney across the mountains to sort of try and find gold, and basically, annihilating the that area of country.
There are many histories in this poem. I suppose there's some that are unsaid as well as the ones that are said, but the ones that are said include the history of the land, of boulders coloured with age and moss, of the fenced-off ruin of the poet's birthplace, of the narrator's journeys through this country, of the creek where gold was found, and the whole Australian gold rush history that you've mentioned, and a song which swirls past the history of this place, singing of a time before gold. Is it that song that endures? Does the poem differentiate between these histories and place more value on the song than on the other histories, or are they all interwoven into one history?
Look, I think that they're all interwoven into one history. You can't look at the history of that place before gold, before it was sort of, settled, without understanding the impacts of what followed. And I guess it's accepting the violence of the colonial past, of the colonial history, and how it impacts on the way you view your own past, memories, and how they get represented in poetry to an extent. Yes, there's the imagined time before gold when you can look at those hills and sort of see, well, those rocks were buried. The forest was different. The bush was different. There are campsites. And there are sacred sites scattered up and down that creek line because it was a source of water. Two creeks came together there. It was actually an important spot. But that's a history that you have to imagine through, talking to people who have that history passed down, and by understanding, what destroyed it.
Yeah.
As I say, this is a developing, history there, because when I wrote those words, I wasn't fully aware of what that time before gold was.
There's almost a poem about the erasure of history too, isn't
it? Yeah. And that's very important. Rediscovering what's been erased, forgotten, all the gaps. A gap in history is something that we want to forget, or somebody wants to forget.
Yeah. And the job of the poet is to remind them.
The poet, the historian, yes, it's Auden once said, poetry makes nothing happen, but that wasn't the extent of what he said. It does exist, in areas where businessmen, would fear to follow. What did he say? Poetry makes nothing happen; it survives a way of happening, a mouth. So, it may not make something happen, but it helps us to understand why something happened, and more people should read poetry.
I can't agree with you more. In this poem, you become part of the landscape.
I
want to come back to the idea of belonging, that we've discussed in relation to the last poem. The sense of belonging is an internal thing, isn't it? It's something that we feel. Is that something that you felt here when you were there? When you became part of the landscape?
And as I said before, I was quite young when this experience happened, and I think I probably just started uni. I was reading the Romantics, so Wordsworth and things like that. So there was that sort of English Romanticism coming into, I guess, my emotion at the time. Over the decades that followed, I think I managed to sort of eliminate a lot of that sort of English Romanticism. There are no daffodils, for example, in this poem, but it was that intensity of feeling. Virginia Woolf calls a moment of being, where you thought, this is a special experience that I need to record somehow. And for 30 years, I couldn't actually record it to a way that I liked. It was very one-dimensional, the way I tried to describe it. So it needed a distance and analysis, I think, before it could actually form a poem.
Would you go so far as to say that it was kind of an epiphany, or was it just a pivotal moment, really?
It was probably verging on an epiphany, just in terms of being able to just listening to things. So, I think most of us have sort of sat next to a river and listened to the sound of the river, or sort of heard bird song and things like that. But for all of them to come together after the noise of the car, I think that was, and then suddenly realizing that there was an awful lot happening in what we thought was silence, in nothingness. And the further you sort of relaxed into that sort of nothingness, the more you actually realized there was things going on. And in particular, I remember sort of realizing what I was listening to was the breeze moving through trees halfway up the hill. It was completely still where I was, but
Mm.
I was listening to a breeze that was somewhere else, and that was sort of quite a realization.
So you were already interested in poetry at the time that you experienced this, but did this, it seems to me like it might have give your poetry impetus.
Look, I think it did. It meant I was working on it for 30 odd years, so yes. Um, but yeah, it's I guess if you talk about epiphanies, yes, um, it was a sort of a turning point in the way I sort of related to the country around me.
And so does it also perhaps have something to do with the direction that your poetry followed afterwards?
Um, yeah, I think this is probably the oldest poem in the book. Yeah.
Mm.
So, hmm.
Okay. Do you want to read another one?
Yep. What's the next one on the
This
list?
one is Shadow Birds.
Okay. Okay. So this has been picked up, I think, for Best Australian Poems of 2025, which I was sort of quite surprised to find out. So somebody's actually read the book and picked a poem from it. So that's nice. Um,
I'm still waiting for that to happen to me.
it will come. It will come. Um, so look, this is sort of there was a lot of there was a period of time recently where there was a lot of talk about you know canceling Western history. The tearing down of statues and things like that. At the same time, there was the Rio Tinto accidentally blowing up
Sacred site.
a cave that had
Mm.
artwork from 20,000 years, um, and sort of going, well, what's when we talk about cancellation, that seems to be a pretty extreme form of it. Um, and I just sort of had this vision of and there's quite a few poems in this book about birds. Those birds that sort of symbolize the message that something's been destroyed, and they're anyway. So that's the context of this poem. It's quite short. Shadow birds. Look behind the lines of police. Shadow birds circle the statues. They will roost tonight. Tomorrow the ground will be covered in black feathers.
So this is one of those poems I think that's about as much about what isn't said as what is said. And it's for readers to try and discern its meaning.
Hmm.
So yeah, how do I as a podcaster quiz a poet about a fine poem? The first thing I was interested in was the location or place of the poem. It isn't stated.
Hmm.
It could be anywhere, though it might be somewhere in particular. There is a clue in the words, the lines of the police,
Hmm.
but it still could be anywhere. Would you like to reveal anything about that, Mark, or leave it to us readers?
Um, Look, I think I should leave it to the reader, but I will sort of say a few words. So the statues, I think at the time, in the UK, in Scotland, there were statues of famous figures from the empire who were slave traders.
Hmm.
They had contributed greatly to the growth of Glasgow and Edinburgh, but on through the slave trade. Um, their statues were torn down and thrown into the Clyde, and there was discussions about cancelling history, and it's like, well, who do we want to commemorate and why? And we had a similar thing in Australia with sort of paint being thrown on statues of Captain Cook and things like that. And I think what I was thinking here is the state protecting the symbols of colonialism. And these birds who are mourning the destruction of history, culture, and the interaction between the two.
Yeah, the poem prompted me to do some research for the symbolic meaning of shadow birds and black feathers.
It'd be interesting to see what you came up with, because that's not something that I was involved when I wrote the poem.
I can tell you a couple of things. In Irish symbolism, shadow birds like ravens and crows represent a complex duality of death and wisdom, often connected to the goddess, the Morrigan. They're seen as omens of war and harbingers of death, but also as guardians of sacred sites and messengers between the world of the living and the spirit world, embodying cycles of transformation. So there was a little bit there.
Yeah.
Did you have a particular role for symbolism of the term shadow birds and black feathers in this poem, or?
Look, the black feathers are obviously, from crows, and I've got a complex relationship with crows because part of my family's history is we're looked over by crows, and that comes from that long period of time that my family's been in Australia. There's been this sort of handed down from generation to generation. The crows will look after you. There's always a crow somewhere looking out for you, and at various times I'll look up and there's a crow on a. I was in Chatsworth, there was a crow on a telegraph pole, sort of, and go, yep, they're there. As a young child, I was playing with a friend. I was probably about 3 or 4, and a crow flew over, and went ark, ark, ark. I thought it was my mother calling me, so I ran home. So crows have a interesting place with me, and their position, the crows and ravens in Irish folklore, is definitely sort of buried in this poem as well. Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about the poem, or just leave it?
No, look, I think it's a very short poem. I'm quite happy with the complexity that is coming out of it. I'm quite proud of it.
Well done. Your next one is Armistice Day.
Quite appropriate, seeing that we've this is 2 days since Armistice Day. So look, this was written shortly after Armistice Day in 2023, with a foreboding of what was happening in the Middle East. But it also is looking back at the history of what has happened since that first Armistice Day in 1918. So the so-called war to end all wars and what's happened since then. So Armistice Day 2023, and it starts with a quote from W.H. Jordan from 1st of September 1939, obviously a poem of significance given what happened in the following 5 to 6 years. So the quote from Jordan goes, "I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return." Over a century ago, some guns fell silent, but the percussive melody of bullet and shell remained a soundtrack for generations who went from newsprint to radio broadcasts and television images to the tenuous reality of social media. A redrawing of colonial lines on a map, a harrowing evolution from direct rule to spheres of influence, marked by an exponential growth in unmarked graves. We remember a history, the bullet to the head, the child buried in the rubble of a building, the slit throat, bodies swinging from trees. Meanwhile, we rushed towards the station, anxious to make the train home, giving the man in the dirty sleeping bag, sheltering in the pedestrian tunnel, a wide berth. Then on Friday night, gathered on the rooftop bar, we watched the pretty explosions of fireworks and listened to dogs barking in the street below.
So I want to go straight to the line in this poem, "We remember a history." because that in itself raises a lot of questions for me. The poem seems to be as much about forgetting as it is about remembering. We go through the motions and perhaps rituals of remembering, but then we gather on the rooftop bar to watch pretty explosions of fireworks. What is the poem saying about remembering exactly?
Well, it's basically saying we don't. Okay, when you know we gather for remembrance, Remembrance Day in particular, you know, we remember the sacrifice and things like that. We don't really. We're not learning from what happened. We keep doing it. Okay, and as long as we avoid thinking about it, then it's going to keep happening.
We just pay rote.
The pretty explosions of fireworks is I mean, I think that's sort of almost out of a 1930s sort of Audenesque sort of poem. But yeah, I was thinking very much of the 1st of September 1939. The poem written at the end of a Lotus on Us decade, and looking to what was going to happen. And it's like, well, this is Armistice Day. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but even as some guns fell silent on the Western Front, there was there was the Russian Revolution. There was the invasion of Russia to sort of help the White Russians. There was ongoing conflict in Africa, in the Middle East, in China, Japan. The war didn't end. It just moved. People were still dying. Civilians were still suffering. Yeah.
The term "we remember a history," suggests to me that it is only one of many histories. That what we remember is received history.
Well, there's a history that I know about, the stories of the wars and the deaths that I know of, but there are lots and lots of other personal histories of people who know of massacres, who have suffered, whose families have suffered, whose countries have suffered. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but is one of the objects of the poem to question the history we remember?
Not particularly. It is a history. It's one of many histories. I'm not sort of saying that we should question whether lynchings happened in the United States in the 1920s. I'm saying that's a history I'm aware of. There were obviously massacres happening in the early 1930s in China, the Japanese invasion of China, that I'm not familiar with. That's another history that would loom large in somebody else's remembering of the 20th century.
But you are not remembering a history individually here, because you say we remember a history. Who is the we that you're referring to?
We are the people reading the poem. It's written from a Western perspective. It's written from somebody who's sort of grown up with a Western history.
But even then, I feel acutely that the history I remember personally is certainly not something shared with other generations, and probably isn't shared with much of my generation.
Yeah, it's. I mean, this is a written history. This is the history that I grew up with. That the people in my classes.
The history that's taught in schools.
It's even the history taught in schools is a history of the bullet to the head, the rubble of buildings during war. Yeah.
Now, Auden is obviously, you've mentioned him a couple of times, is important to you in this poem. He had considerable prescience to say what he said when he said it. What is your thinking about Auden in the quote, and what it can add to the poem that you've written?
So that war is basically self-perpetuating. You know, um, I I kill somebody in your family, you kill somebody in my family. There's no circuit breaker. And particularly looking at the situation in the Middle East, it was, well, there's a history there that doesn't start on a particular date. There's no circuit breaker. The violence continues. So yeah, it was. I guess that phrase, the low dishonest decade, that saw the rise of fascism in Europe, lies heavy over this poem.
Yes, I think it would take enormous courage and political will to actually impose a circuit breaker unilaterally, and no one's ever been willing to do it.
Mm.
It's not in my idealistic view of the world. It's not impossible for a leader to take that position. But maybe the people of the leader wouldn't let them. But yeah,
yeah. I mean, I think what Auden's doing there is taking a something at a personal level and then extending it to bit far beyond that.
Yeah.
But it's a it's a trait that sort of the English schoolyard of the 1930s, the public school boys, perpetuating violence against each other.
Yeah.
Happens at a societal level as well. And of course, that poem, 1st September 1939, Auden used the rhythms of Yeats's Easter 1916 in it as well. So it's a poem that is built on top of the foundations of another poem as well. So yeah.
All right. Next one is Elegy, page 40.
Elegy. Okay, so this is a poem, excuse me, for a friend of mine, Gina. If anybody has a copy of very early copies of P76 magazine, the magazine that Adam Aitken and I started in 1982, the first four issues of that magazine were done on a Stetner machine, and the covers were silk screened, and Gina did the silk screening and a lot of the illustrations in those early magazines as well. So back in the sort of 1980s, we were quite good friends, and yeah, this is just a poem written when I learnt that she had died. Elegy for GG. It could almost have been beautiful the way Darlinghurst span around the car. From the passenger seat, you watched your life, past and future, play through the windscreen like a drive-in movie without a soundtrack. As a telegraph pole threatened the narrative, you wondered if this future was real or imagined. After finding the blood on your shirt had come from the driver's shattered nose, you were surprised to be apparently uninjured. The world had come to a halt, and you still had a future. You told me you saw oceans, waves and beaches, even a glimpse of a dolphin's fin through that windscreen. And I think of it now after I hear that yesterday you were scattered off a north coast beach, ashes now on a southerly current, floating towards a city you left behind.
I'm really interested, Mark, in why you wanted to read this poem today, because as far as I know, I can't recall another elegy being read so far in Poets' Corner, and it's a form that many poets employ. It's got a tremendous poetic tradition. So, can you say something about why you wanted to read that today?
Look, Gina was a very good friend, particularly during that period of time. We lived around the corner from each other, and she she was a very talented artist. She went on to be a very talented architect. She actually designed the house that Kit Kellen and Carol Archer live in.
In Markwell.
So yeah,
Yeah.
she was a very 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 talented person. Um, we drifted away over later years, but there was that incident where she was involved in a car accident. Now, once again, I tried to write about that years ago, and it didn't actually work.
Mm.
Then it suddenly seemed to fit into this poem. So thinking about, you know, finding out that somebody you knew quite well, you'd worked with, had died, and she, she lived in Sydney for ages, moved back to where she, was grew up on around Byron Bay, and yeah, so her ashes were scattered, and she had left Sydney, didn't really want to come back, and her ashes were sort of drifting down the coast. So it's sort of like a tribute, memories. Yeah, it's. I think it's a way of paying tribute to someone who is who is a friend and is also a very talented person. I'm actually working on another elegy at the moment for Moya Costello, who's died recently, and there's a memorial for her in a week or so's time. So that's another sort of difficult. They're difficult poems to write because they are very deeply personal, and they're obviously growing out of tragedy. So yeah,
They're difficult to write close to the time that the person passes. I think
mm.
you need a bit of distance. But I think every poet writes elegies. But I wonder. I know it's a tribute, but I wonder if it's more for the poet themselves than for the departed person.
Oh yeah, it's I think a lot of the ceremony that takes place after somebody's death is as much for the people who are left behind than the person who's no longer there.
Mm.
But it's also I guess a remembrance, in the same way as we put a plaque up or a headstone. It is a remembrance of someone and of a friendship.
Did you find that like you tried to write about the car accident years ago, it didn't work? Did you find that this, with the sort of, I don't know, with the sort of immediacy of her passing, that the poem came to you, or you came to the poem more readily?
Yeah. There was, I'd thought about how to sort of write the poem, and it was, I remember her describing she was a passenger in the car. It was a mini, an old mini, back when minis were minis, and it took place in Darlinghurst, and the car spun a number of times before it hit a telegraph pole, and how while it was happening, it obviously, the whole slow motion thing was taking place. She was thinking about a whole lot of things, where she grew up, and she saw a dolphin and all those sorts of strange things you might feel. So that really struck me at the time, and then the sort of reaction afterwards when she sort of looked down, there was blood, and she thought, "My God, what's happened?" She realised it was actually from the driver who'd shattered their nose, and the car was a write-off, but that they were basically okay.
Mm.
There was, that was the original poem, was about that feeling, but it didn't seem to have there wasn't really a conclusion there. It was sort of hanging. So, I guess death is the ultimate conclusion. So it seemed to fit into that format.
Yeah. There's a surprise in the poem when she gets a second chance at life, when she found out that she still had a future, as you put it. Do you know how the near-death experience affected the way that she later lived her life?
Um, to a degree, but it's sort of there are other things that happen as well. Probably, is best left unsaid in terms of that her personal sort of journey. Yeah.
The last line speaks of a city you left behind, but the subject's friends like you were also left behind. How much of the grief of those left behind do you think is because the departed has gone somewhere they can't follow?
Yeah, look, I mean, there is that there because in, the last 2 decades or so, there was very little communication between us, not through any reason, but sort of distance and
Drift.
yeah. And she wasn't active on social media, so that's the way we keep our contacts up these days.
Okay. Would you like to read Returns?
Yeah. So this is an interesting one because this is the Irish poem. When I talk about place and memory, history, this is a very personal one because it is about returning to the land where a lot of my ancestors came from. And once again, this is a developing sort of theme as well, because in the second part, the Yellow Sea Chest, I talk about my great-grandmother. Now, we've just come back from Ireland, and one of the places we went to there was the town where my great-grandmother was born. So we still have the sea chest in the house I'm living in now. So it was quite an interesting experience to sort of go to a small town in Tipperary where she grew up, where that sea chest originated from. So that happened after the writing of this poem. So I'm still sort of discovering more about her and the history of, my other Irish ancestors. But she was a person who instilled a lot of the Irishness into my grandfather, which will become apparent in the poem. Returns. 1. Hidden. Leaving Melbourne, flying northwest across desert. Below, darkness, scattered lights. Even in daylight, stories are hidden here. At night, they call to us, singing across country, reaching into the sky. In this plane, we eat, watch a movie, try to sleep. 2. Yellow Sea Chest. As per airline instructions, we have each packed 2 bags to travel 30 hours to Dublin. We have left behind my great-grandmother's sea chest, which contained all her possessions when she travelled to Sydney 150 years ago. She had luggage restrictions as well. 1 sea chest for everything she wanted to keep for a new life away from hunger and the English. The sea chest has secret compartments and pictures from the 1860s varnished onto boards. The leather straps have rotted away, and my grandfather painted it yellow during the Depression, a bright colour to cheer things up. The curved top of the chest meant that it had to be stacked on top of the pile of cases in the hold. It indicated that my great-grandmother had a little more social standing than most. 3. Leaving Roscommon, Angota Moor. We drive out through the gates, the chill in our bones, a reminder of a history that follows us down these short country roads. A land that tugs at memory, my grandfather's stories of why the English can't be trusted, exporting grain while his grandparents starved, his mother hung by her hair from a roof beam. These things are hard to forget, even across generations. 4. Dublin GPO. Along with the saints, my grandfather taught me the names of the martyrs. Patrick Pearse, Thomas McDough, Thomas Clark, Joseph Plunkett, William Pearce, Edward Daly, Michael O'Hanrahan, John McBride, Eamon Kennett, Michael Mallon, Sean Houston, Con Colbert, James Connolly, Sean McDermott. He had just turned 16 when the Easter uprising erupted on the other side of the world. 50 years he still held that anger. He told me that they had to rope Connolly to a chair in front of the firing squad because his ankle had been shattered by a bullet in the GPO. My grandfather never saw Ireland, but today I silently tell him there is no Union Jack flying on the Dublin GPO.
As you mentioned, place, history, and memory all feature in this poem.
Mm.
I want to start with a question about the first section of the poem, Hidden. It addresses something I feel acutely, that no matter how much we interrogate the landscape around us, and in this poem, beneath us, it is brimming with stories and histories we will never know. Our knowledge and understanding of place, of the story and history of place, is necessarily piecemeal and incomplete. Can we do no more than just sense them as they call to us singing across country, reaching into the sky? Or do you think we have some responsibility to try to excavate those stories?
A simple answer is yes and no. I think we need to be aware that they exist, that there are histories there and stories that exist that we can't know about. But there are parts of that history and stories that relate to us, which we will be able to sort of find out if, use our imagination, use whatever we need to get to those stories.
I'm really interested in the generational aspect of this poem. We know that there is intergenerational trauma, that can even be genetically transmitted between generations. But this poem is exploring a weaving of stories across generations, stories of your great-grandmother, your grandfather and his grandparents. And both the stories and memories are passed on so that you remember not only your memories, but other family members' memories. Memory becomes something other than just personal memory, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of these are the oral histories that get passed down through families, and I think the Irish are very good at it. The English not so, because there's that whole storytelling tradition in Ireland that I think came through that side of my family. It was the stories from their past, probably embellished a little bit, but sort of, that's what my grandfather grew up with, and they're the stories that he repeated as well. And they're stories that I now have, and I've added to them. So when I went back to Ireland and saw the GPO, saw the bullet holes in the walls, I was able to make that connection back through, through my family to my grandfather who told me those things, and then further back to, his parents, people I hadn't met, but whose stories I was aware of. Yeah.
But it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? I really am interested in generational memory being transmitted, but that transmission is problematic sometimes because, first of all, you can lumber another generation with a burden it doesn't want, or you can pass on prejudices and other things that are not necessarily a good thing.
Yes, but it's I think there's an acknowledgement there. Yes, you can pass down prejudices, but you also have to acknowledge that things happened. So it's interesting that the story of young girls being hung from their hair in beams is a story that I've heard from a number of different, at least two other people of Irish descent, whose parents were, or whose ancestors came out at similar times after the famine. So you go, well, that isn't just a family story. It seems to be, something that was fairly common practice, a form of, torture or what, a family sort of, intimidation that was utilized. So, these are things that need to be acknowledged. And I think you by acknowledging and, you can grow and accept the past, and they don't have to become part of a prejudice. This is, I think, when people talk about, people like Tony Abbott talk about the black armband version of history, which is his reaction to understanding what happened in Australia, the sort of massacres at the frontier wars, things like that. It's not sort of it's doesn't necessarily have to result in prejudice now. It's acknowledging that something happened is just part of knowing why we're here. The Mole Creek Massacre, for example, the memorials that take place there every year involve descendants of both the people who were, massacred and the people who, massacred them. It can be a coming together, an understanding of, what happened. And, as per the armistice poem, that can be the circuit breaker, by articulating a part of you that has been an intergenerational sort of trigger, can help resolve it.
But I'm thinking here of your grandmother, your grandfather, who held on to an anger that wasn't his for 50 years. I mean, it wasn't his anger. He inherited it.
Yeah. But he was of a time. So, I think it's also in that context a way of the Catholic, the way the Catholic Church worked as well. There's if you think of the way that's described in terms of the martyrs, the Catholic martyrs of the Irish Church, we're getting into that portrait of the artist as a young man sort of area. It's he was deeply Catholic. He retained his Irishness, and that was just part of growing up. Was you had the saints, the martyrs, but these were also the martyrs for Ireland. And in terms of I guess the story of the Irish Republic, the Easter 1916 sort of is quite central. We were actually in Dublin in 2016, and the celebration of the centenary of the uprising was sort of a very interesting thing to see. It would have been uncomfortable to be a British person travelling to Dublin that year.
When you go to Dublin, you are reprising your great-grandmother's trip from Dublin to Australia 150 years ago. She didn't return, and your grandfather never went to Ireland. So what exactly is the poem's title, Returns, referring to? Can you return to somewhere you've never left?
So part of that is so many of my ancestors are from Ireland. So there's a constant stream of people from 1796 through to 1865 leaving Ireland to come to Australia. So there is a sense there that I've got ancestors scattered over most of Ireland. I can go to, most counties and go, yes, I've got a connection there. It may be pretty tenuous, but some areas like Tipperary, Cork, and Ulster and Armagh in the north, I've got particularly strong connections too. So understanding that part of my history, it did feel like a return. It was the first time since in the direct line in my family that anybody had actually returned to Ireland since they'd left.
Oh,
So that's the term of return is a return to from where a lot of my family came from.
a generational return.
It's a generational return, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Now you mentioned that this poem is something that you're still working through in ongoing work. Can you say something of the significance of this poem to you?
Look, I think it's very important because it's where I sort of stated that Ireland is quite an important part of my being.
Mm.
Following sort of the 2016 trip, we published an online anthology of Irish Australian poets in Rochford Street Review, and that was actually I did a lot of research into contemporary Irish poetry, made some very good friends from that. Began a correspondence with the poet Kevin Higgins, which continued up until his death. He's one of a major influence of mine over the last decade, I guess. So when I talk about history and place, Ireland is actually fairly front and center there as well. So I referred to earlier on about the colonization being practiced on the Irish. There's lots of parallels between what happened in Ireland and what happened in Australia. There are also sort of many contradictions about what Irish people did once they came to Australia. It's I guess it's an interest in post-colonial societies and how we develop, and Australia and Ireland are the two personal examples that I have.
Mm. All right, you have one more poem for us, which is part of the title sequence of poems in this book, Office of Literary Endeavours.
Okay, probably a good one to end on. So this poem is the character in this poem is actually a character from a novel I'm working on. But yeah, well, we'll see how that develops. The Office of Literary Endeavours. 1. Before beginning her poem, Marie set out to walk across the mountains to the Office of Literary Endeavours. Unfortunately, as she crossed a crumbling bridge, she slipped and fell into the valley. Her death went unannounced except for a small bird and an old tree, who remembered her poem and recited it softly to any traveller who passed by. 2. Marie had been mumbling her poem when she slipped on a loose stone and toppled off the bridge. As she fell, she began to shout the words, feeling them ripped from her mouth before they were formed. The poem was all through her as she lay amongst the stones at the bottom of the valley. Her mind flashed the colour of her words a final time, brilliant colours that dispersed into a sunset. The poem remained etched in her bones as the skin fell away. The words in her fingers, toes, belly and heart dissolved into the earth. A bird pecking at her eye removed a phrase. The wind blew away the dust of letters.
I love the title of this poem. I think it describes all of us writers in a way, beavering away at our words. And it could be where each of us writes, even though Marie in this poem never gets to the Office of Literary Endeavours. But is such an office a physical place at all, or just what goes on in all of our heads as we try out and perhaps mumble the lines of our poems and stories to ourselves?
Yeah, it's interesting because in each of the three poems that refer to the office, it's different things. Here, it's a mythical place that she's trying to get to. In the second one, it's actually a room that smells of dog. And in the third one, it's a long sort of prose poem about Marie leaving Rome to fly to the town where the Office of Literary Endeavours is situated, which is being besieged by rebels. So it's it's like Italo Calvino's sort of Venice. It's lots of different things, and depending on the context and whatever, it's different. There is a novel I'm working on, which I've been working on for a long time, with the Marie character in it. She's a filmmaker in that poem, in that story, and there's another character who's a writer. But yeah, it's the Office of Literary Endeavours, I guess, is an imagined place. It's sort of like the mythical residency where everything sort of comes together.
Can you tell us a bit about Marie? How did she come to you? What is she doing in these 3 poems that bookend your book and occupy they're very strategically placed in the book?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what she's doing in the poem, because in the novel she's a very different character. She's a filmmaker, and she's trying to make a film in a very cluttered city, a city that's sort of collapsing in upon itself. So she sort of escaped from the novel into a poem. And I guess that's sort of part of the freedom of the imagination, is that you can have characters sort of acting out things in different circumstances. It was refreshing not to be an I character. So,
yeah,
the poem isn't in the first person; it's in the third person. Probably would have been interesting work writing in the first person as a body decaying into the component words and phrases, but yeah.
So in this poem, the poet and her poem are intertwined. They're inseparable. The poem is part of the essence of the poet. The poem was all through her, as you put it. Does that describe your relationship to poetry, Mark?
At times, yes. At other times, the poem escapes me completely.
It's flying past. I can see one. There you go.
So I guess in the opposite of literary endeavors, that's what you become one with a poem.
Yeah.
It's a Zen notion of sort of you don't need to write it because you are the poem.
You are the poem. This poem actually is in part about remembering, a small bird and an old tree who remembered her poem.
Yeah.
But the poet, and perhaps the art of poetry, is portrayed as in the margins. The poet's death went unnoticed, other than by the bird and the tree. Is this a commentary on the marginal place of poetry in our society?
Well, yes, I guess it is to a point. It also sort of goes back to the sort of, place in history. It's a forgotten history. Something happened that in the mainstream wasn't very important. Like, Auden's poem on the death of Yeats. Sort of, it's a few hundred people will think upon this day and remember. It's but the death of the poet isn't kept from the poem. The poem is the part of the poet. So yeah, it's. I think it's all of those things. It's a forgotten history. It's a comment on the marginal nature of poetry. Yeah.
It's also in part about mortality. What we take with us when we depart, and the fragments of what we leave behind, and how ephemeral we and they are. It's interesting. It's expressed in a matter-of-fact and unsentimental way, and I think with resignation in its tone. But it doesn't matter in a way. We still set out to walk across the mountains. This is our vocation, and this is what we do. Is that right? Have I?
Yeah, and that the poem becomes part of the dirt.
Yep, back to the dirt. Okay, finally, last question. I want to return to your theme of the poetry of place, history, and memory, and ask you how this poem fits into the theme. Does your theme encapsulate imagined place, history, and memory?
Yes. Yeah. Because a lot of our memory is imagined. And
unreliable.
And yes. So is it a real history? Is it an imagined history? And does it matter if it doesn't impact anybody else and we have an imagined history which is questionable? Does it matter? If it makes a good poem, does that matter? So if we make up a history that impacts somebody else, obviously that becomes very problematic. Okay, so if we pretend a massacre didn't happen or a war didn't happen, or if we imagined, a massacre that never happened, that wasn't actually real, that's actually impacting people. Okay, but if we can sort of look at history, look at the gaps, and go, okay, these gaps can be filled with this imagined history. We're getting into the realm of historical fiction, taking a character and imagining what they are, but a lot of history is like that. You'll have historians writing about what a particular historical figure may have thought. I can remember a literary biography that discussed what Sylvia Plath was feeling, and you're going, well, hang on, how do you get to that point? That's an imagined, how do you state that? So yes, I think imagination is part of history. As far as I'm willing to use it, it fills in the gaps. It fills in the lacuna. It creates a sense of place, history, and memory. But as long as it's used ethically, and one of the issues is when you're talking about remembered histories of place that belong to Indigenous people, is that you actually have to sort of be aware of those histories to talk to those people and get their permissions as well.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation about the poetry of place, history, and memory. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, David.
It's been a pleasure. When this video is posted, it will include information on how to obtain copies of Mark's books, so look out for that. Poets Corner will return in a month with Jazz Money, reading and discussing poems on the theme of deep time. See you then.